Hi there, my name is Peter Boumgarden and I am the Koch Professor Practice for Family Enterprise at the Olin Business School. I've been the director of the center since 2021, and over the last couple of years, one of the things that we've been doing is to expand our focus from family business to also considerations of family finance and family office, as well as family philanthropy. One of the things that is worth thinking about here in the context of family business is that family business really runs the gamut from everything from your small business all the way up to your large enterprise in particular. So just to give you a sense of that context, if you look at a couple different ratings or rankings of where family business falls, depending on how it's defined, whether or not it's founder-led or family-owned, you can have everything from your Walmarts of the world to your Berkshire Hathaways to your Ford Motor Company, etc. And so as a result, one of the things that we think a lot about is how you actually find ways to understand this space well. So we do our best to be able to understand this in the issues of things that are uniting those different focuses. And that's really at the core strategic ownership, or broadly ownership that's strategic across a group of individuals in some kind of relationship. And so just to give you a sense of what that looks like in the context of the work that we do in the classroom environment, I want to be able to take you to this framing here. So imagine, for example, you have really considerations around the purpose of the enterprise, both family and business. You have questions around governance of both the family and the business itself. And then what we tend to think about around succession, all the way from ownership, succession to control and management. So all of those things broadly are shaped by things surrounding this set of decision makings, including where the market's at, the country in particular, the cultural influences from that country, the structure of the family, and then also finally the family control. Some of those things are controlled internally by the group, and some of those things are external influences that you have little focus over. And so broadly, when it comes to the work that we do, one of the things that's central to our work is finding ways to bring that out to the community, and then also to illuminate those insights with the context around research more broadly. To the question around what is possible uniquely around purpose with family enterprise, I think one of the things that you have to look at is actually what's possible with concentrated control. So a central guiding focus of this, whether it's from the Walmarts of the world or to the mom and pop shop, is that there's control that's concentrated in a smaller set of hands, fewer hands than it would be in a public corporation, for example. And so I want to look just briefly at one of my colleagues' work. This is from Ben Means, who is a legal scholar out of University of South Carolina. He makes a case a few years back around the benefit of control, whether it's the Facebooks or the Googles of the world, or, again, the Walmarts of the world, is that it allows you to be able to define what's possible in this space by expanding what a fiduciary responsibility entails. And so in other words, there's an economic opportunity, but it requires a mix of stewardship more broadly on the part of the family itself. So stewardship to define exactly what it looks like to do those things well. So when it comes to what's uniquely possible for family enterprises, one of the things that we need to think about is what actually makes family enterprises different than others. And some of the research is pretty clear that one of the core things that's involved in this is what's called socio-emotional wealth. So not just financial wealth motivations, but socio-emotional wealth. So again, we tend to think of those things in the context of the dysfunctions of what a socio-emotional wealth consideration might look like. So broadly, there's some work by Nick Bloom that I'll just highlight right here. Nick Bloom's argument is that in the midst of this context of family enterprise, sometimes the family firms are less well managed than others compared to dispersed shareholders or private equity. Now, I think there's some truth to pieces of this, but I think there's probably a wide range, wide variance there in terms of what actually is happening in the context of these families. And so I think what we need to look at as well is the context of what actually does drive the uniqueness in this space. And so I'll go just briefly to what we actually know about socio-emotional wealth. Key takeaway on this is socio-emotional wealth actually seems to be related to high performance in organizations. So socio-emotional wealth changes how you think of strategy, it changes how you do governance, and also changes how you relate to non-stakeholder folks that are involved in that space. And broadly, a wide meta-analysis looking at 350 studies actually shows that these factors on the whole actually do lead to higher performance if done well. So in my view, there's a deep potential of what we can actually see in family enterprise, but it needs to get over some of the challenges of management. And so I've been talking to several folks about this, including Dave Wharton at the Tugboat Institute and Spencer Burke at the St. Louis Trust Company. And one of the things that we were discussing recently is that really what you need to think about is not just management, but you also need to think about other factors involved that allow you to be strategic owners. So for example, what's your investment thesis? How is your balance strength? What does board governance look like? How quick are you to decisions, amongst other things? And so as a result, though you might have something where a family-owned organization is lower on management professionalism, if you end up having other things that are significant strengths here, as outlined in this space, you actually might end up with quite a high-performing organization. So in other words, a mix of stewardship coupled with control, and then also management and strategic competence is a big part of what's possible with a private company that's maybe more difficult in a public counterpart. One of the questions that's often asked is the question around whether or not purpose should transition as the enterprise transitions, or in particular as ownership transitions. I think that's possible. In fact, there's some really unique things that are possible in transition, including being able to reset the vision or to step back and to say this is a chance to do something new. And yet for many organizations, there's also a desire to blend continuity with change. So again, one of the benefits of control over a longer time period is the ability to actually have continuity of how to think about the market, how to think about culture of this organization. And so in my view, one of the things that families should wrestle with in the midst of transition is really this question of what needs to stay the same, because it's actually something that binds us to one another, to our communities, actually allows us to have an advantage compared to those that change more often. And then where do we actually have to find a way to look at things in a different way? And that's actually one of the things that's possible with a shift of control and ownership, is the ability to look at those questions anew. Along with the consideration around transitions is also the question around how you align on purpose more broadly across a group of stakeholders. And so I've found Josh Barron's research quite compelling here, that one of the things to consider is these mix of motivations around how different stakeholders, or shareholders in this case, are drawn towards one of three things. They might be drawn towards liquidity, they might be drawn towards growth, and they might be drawn towards control. And his argument in the Family Business Handbook is you can't have all three, but rather you actually have to spend some time choosing one or two of those as being a priority. And so the key challenge with many organizations is to really spend some time aligning on the focus on those three components, and then finding a way to be able to structure that into governance in ways that hold the group accountable when there's a tendency to say, well, let's spin off a little bit more liquidity at this point. So to me, again, that becomes one of the things that's possible in this space of doing closely held ownership, but it does require aligning the organization and the owners of that organization effectively. One really important question is how an orientation towards purpose actually might detract from performance. And so I can tell you all the times that it can actually drive a positive orientation, show you some of the research by Ben Means and others around the value of insider control or the way that socio-emotional wealth drives performance of the firm. But anyone who's seen Yellowstone or Succession, or just even seen the small mom and pop shops struggle with these things, can realize that it doesn't always drive those pieces. And so I'll name one that I think is important, and I think it's this idea around succession. So when you identify future owners of the organization, or perhaps future leaders of the organization, one potential tension is letting that outweigh the focus around how you actually perform, selecting someone who's not fit or not ready to go to lead that organization. But we think of that in the context of competence. I actually think it's worth looking at that as well from the context of the person who's giving up control. And so in that sense, I want to take you to a pretty interesting study that came out a couple years back called Shadow of the Prince. And interestingly enough, it looked at three different forms of succession. One, succession in the Chinese monarchies. The second, actually a dyadic set of relationships in Taiwan and modern day China. And then finally a survey for family firms in China, modern day. And one of the things that they found is this interesting relationship between the willingness on the part of the person taking control and also the ability. So when the willingness and the ability are low, what you see there is that the control is quite high on the part of the person giving up the control here, right? So in other words, the person coming after me is not quite competent, so I'm actually going to be high controlling in this sense. But interestingly enough, if you actually look at it as well, when willingness to take over and ability to take over is high, control starts to creep up again. So put this in context of transitions. I've led this organization, I've led it well, and now my daughter is coming to take over. She expresses high willingness and high ability. Well, sometimes that can actually be a threat to me as a leader of this organization. So in other words, I actually might exercise a little bit too much control, holding back the control away from the next generation, allowing them to thrive. So in my view, one of the key takeaways here is that some of the things that are social and emotional that bind us together in rich ways in these organizations, if not handled in a certain kind of maturity way, can actually prevent high competence leaders from taking the organization where it needs to go moving forward. So what are some examples of purpose done really uniquely in the context of a privately held firm? Well, I want to take you to one that you might not think of in the context of a family firm, but nonetheless it has some interesting lessons for us. And that's the example of Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia. So if you've been following this story at all, Yvon Chouinard is trying to determine what he wants in terms of succession of ownership from him as a founder-led company. He didn't want to succeed ownership and management to his family, and so as a result set up a perpetual purpose trust where the definition of what success looks like at the level of ownership actually is about driving financial performance for the owner of the environment. Now, there's a number of things involved in that work, but to me that's an interesting example of someone playing around with purpose. I've got a good friend as well, Ari, who runs Zingerman's. They've used a similar kind of structure. But we don't have to look to large examples like that. I've spent a little time with Chris Hoffman recently and hearing from Chris and Joe about how they built Hoffman Brothers, an HVAC company based out of St. Louis. Some of the things that he talks about in the midst of this idea of purpose is actually seen in how they've expanded their educational servings for their employees, how they actually paid above market rate in order to get further retention for their employees as they expanded into Nashville. Some of those things would not be seen as being oriented towards high performance in the short run. And so I think Chris's ability and Joe's ability to say, this is how we define success, allowed them to really enter into the market in some pretty creative ways. Finally, I would look at something like the Taylor family in St. Louis, not just with enterprise, but also some of their work in the family office, some of the work that they've done in terms of the MLS team, the way that they've designed that stadium, the way they've built out that approach really does indicate a higher level of purpose, or at least creative ideas of impact beyond the self, beyond just the family wanting the best for them as financial performers, but also oriented towards St. Louis as a broader market. So maybe let's just end with a couple of quick points around what I would see as being key takeaways around purpose of the private enterprise. And a big point that I would raise is that this is centrally about defining what it means to be a strategic owner. We talk a lot in business schools about management. We talk about how to manage others towards high performance. But in the context of private ownership, you really have to think about what it is that you want to be organizing this organization. So those can be family values that are built into the structure of the firm. They can be the owner's priorities around, again, ownership, role, control, and liquidity. And then finally, I think there's a question around whether or not a longer time horizon allows you to think in slightly different ways about how you structure in your purpose. So I'm incredibly excited about the possibilities for purpose for family enterprise, and also the same point would encourage these organizations to really think strategically about what this means, because there are examples where it actually isn't done quite well at all, when the purpose becomes too narrow, or perhaps the lack of strong management prevents the organization from doing what it could do for the employees, for the owners, and for their broader communities.